And thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me into your digital room today. I wish I could be with you in person. My name is Matthew Young. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Greo Evidence Insights, and we worked collaboratively with Internet Insights Market Research and the National Betting Authority to complete a study looking at gambling and problem gambling in the Republic of Cyprus. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of some of the findings. The full findings are available in a report that I believe will be available on the authority's website in the near future. So I'll begin. So to begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did in the study, and then I'll talk about what we found. A little bit, some information about the rates of problem and high-risk gambling in the Republic of Cyprus, and then a few summaries and implications. So to begin, the purpose of the study was to really assess rates of gambling participation and problem gambling in the Republic of Cyprus. But most importantly, perhaps using internationally comparable methods. So one of the reasons that we worked very closely with Insights Market Research on this is because we worked with a team that has had a lot of experience doing international studies of this sort. The results of this study will be very helpful in understanding the rates of gambling harms in Cyprus and will serve as a foundation from which to build a public health approach to address gambling harms. So what did we do? Well, what we did is we collected information about people's gambling participation and harms from gambling, and we did so using a questionnaire, a survey. The data was collected by Insights Market Research via computer-assisted telephone interviews. These interviews were conducted between November and December 2022. The total sample size that of people that responded to our questionnaire was 2,950 people living in Cyprus during the dates I noted. For sample characteristics, we collected the data using stratified multi-stage sampling, and this was based on age, sex, district, and area of residence. We also weighted the data that we received using the Cyprus census, and these data were weighted based on ethnicity, education level, and a few other variables. And this is a graph here. You can see the distribution of the sample throughout the Republic of Cyprus. There was also interest from the authority that we looked to see how the numbers that were generated from this study were comparable to other international prevalence estimates. And so we also conducted a systematic search of comparable studies that were conducted between January 2019 and March 2021. Those were in order to have comparable data that were more recent. So what did we find? Well, first I'll tell you the results of the systematic search. There were about 10 studies that met our inclusion criteria. Of these studies, 5 used very similar methods, and we found were more directly comparable to the methods used in the current study. These studies were mainly from Australia, so there were 3 studies that were conducted in Australia since 2019, and there was 2 European studies, one from France and one from the Republic of Ireland. Now, for gambling in Cyprus, how many people gamble? What we found was that in 2022, 55.3% of people living in Cyprus reported gambling at least once in the last year. So what this means is that there's about 360,000 adults living in Cyprus gambled in the past year. This gambling participation rate is certainly in line with what we see in other countries. We can see that it's a little bit higher than the European comparative countries in France and Republic of Ireland, but comparable and in some ways a little bit lower than what we see in Australia. Among those who gamble, certainly they are more likely to be male and more likely to be in the age range of 18 to 34. And among those people who did indicate that they gambled in the last year, almost 3/4 indicated they gambled around approximately once per month. So what did they gamble on? So the most popular types of gambling among people in Cyprus was lottery gambling. This was not surprising, as I'll show you on the next slide, as lottery gambling tends to be the most common form of gambling internationally. This was followed by sports betting or betting on other events, and bingo. Those were the top 3 forms of gambling in the Republic of Cyprus. As I indicated, lottery is by far and away the most popular form of gambling we see internationally regularly throughout the world. The second and third most popular forms of gambling within different countries do depend a lot on the culture. They depend a lot on the local regulations, as well as how long different types of gambling has been available within those nations. So to compare Republic of Cyprus, we see sports betting is the number 2. We do see similar things in some of the studies. In Australia, race betting, which is similar to sports betting, is number 2. Similar France as well, and bookmakers shops, which is not exactly the same, but does include some sports betting, is number 2 in Ireland. It was also important for us to take a look a bit at online versus in-person gambling. We do know from a growing literature in this area that online gambling has been linked to a greater risk of harms. A lot of the research indicates that it may be because it's very available to people. They can do it anywhere from the comfort of their homes, on their phones, anywhere. What we found was among gamblers in Cyprus, among people who gambled in the last year, 14.1% reported gambling online in the last year. And among those people gambling online, the most popular activity to engage in online was sports betting, with 11.7% of people who gambled in the last year reporting engaging in online sports betting. So now let's shift to looking at the harms. So we also assessed the rates of problem gambling and high-risk gambling in Cyprus, and I'll explain to you what I mean by the distinction between those two in a second. So in order to measure problem gambling in Cyprus, we used what was called the Problem Gambling Severity Index. This is an internationally recognized instrument. It's the most widely used instrument to measure problem gambling in the world at this point. And what it does is it looks at among people who gamble, and it asks them a series of 9 questions. And based on the responses to these questions, people will be categorized into one of 4 categories: non-problem gamblers, low-risk gamblers, moderate-risk gamblers, and problem gamblers. And it's the problem gambling category that is associated with the most amount of harm, and fewer among moderate risk and low risk. What we see here on the bottom row, you can see here is what we found from our sample is the rates of gambling and problem gambling in Republic of Cyprus. So we can see here is 44.9% report not gambling the past year. Among gamblers, 44.1% met the criteria for non-problem gambling, 6% low risk, 3.6% moderate risk, and 1.5% problem gambling. How does this compare internationally? It's within the range historically of what we see internationally. So historically, problem gambling prevalence rates have been found to range between 0.4% and 8.1. Now, 8.1 is very high. But usually when I'm speaking, I usually say that problem gambling rates are between 1% to 2% is generally where they rest. Certainly the rates that we note in the Republic of Cyprus, when we compare it to the 5 comparable studies that we pulled out, is at the higher end. Although it is still comparable. So that's where we are there. Now, in this study and in studies similar to this, what we want to do is we want to understand a little bit more what is going on and what some of the correlates and some of the predictors are among people who are at risk of harms. And so what we will often do here is, because when in our sampling, we don't end up getting a very large sample of people who meet the criteria for problem gambling. So what we will oftentimes do is we'll recategorize them for the purpose of analysis. So what we do here is, and this has been done quite frequently in the literature. What we do is we take a group of problem gamblers and combine them with a portion of the group of moderate risk gamblers that have been found to have similar characteristics. And we group them into a group called high risk gamblers. And then we take the group of low risk and moderate risk and put them together into a group of at risk gamblers in the middle. So when we do this, we get a larger sample size, and this is really an analytical strategy in order for us to do some more complex analyses. So what we do when we conduct this, we find that there's 8.5% are at risk and 2.6% meet the high risk category that are ready to do these analyses. So now we're ready to kind of look to see, well, what are the characteristics of people who gamble at higher risk in Cyprus? So to begin with, we find they're overwhelmingly male. So you can see on the right here, under sex, that 92% of the high-risk gamblers in the Republic of Cyprus were found to be male, compared to the total sample, which was 46% male. They also tend to be aged 18 to 34. Which is not surprising. This is consistent with international literature, as is the sex distribution. Although I would say the sex distribution here, it tends to be greater than what we see internationally. What else do we see? Well, the other things that are generally expected in the population is, compared to non-problem gamblers, high-risk gamblers are more likely to report tobacco use. They're also more likely to report binge drinking. So this is consumption of 5 or more alcoholic beverages in a single occasion. We also know that high-risk gamblers also report a poorer mental health. So they report generally being less happy when asked to rate their happiness in the last year, and also report a greater likelihood of serious mental health issues in the last year. Now, I think this is an interesting slide here, and I'll linger on it for a little bit longer. We do see a pattern of the kinds of gambling activities that people who are at different risk levels do engage in. So you can see up here, I'll move my cursor up here, we see a kind of a predictable pattern within lottery gaming. So overwhelmingly, the majority of people who are non-problem gamblers engage in lottery play. That's to be expected. Lottery is an activity that is associated with very low levels of risk. This is because it's considered a discontinuous form of gambling. That means that somebody will place a bet, and then they have to wait a period of time before they they know the outcome. This limits the frequency of engagement, as well as limits the amount of spending that can take place on the game. But if we look over here at sports betting and betting on other events, we see it kind of reverses. So we do see that among high-risk gamblers, almost 75 or 3/4 of people who are high-risk gamblers report gambling on sports betting or other events. We also see a similar pattern in fruit or slot machines and casino table games. And this is also this is not surprising. We see this internationally, and and kind of supports a growing recognition that the type of gambling activity can be quite predictive of harm. And this is because these games are really associated with frequent betting and a very short period of time between when one places the bet and when one knows the outcome. And so it's more conducive to spending a large amount of money, playing more frequently, and playing more often. So just to sum up, so among high-risk gamblers, sports betting and other events was the most popular form of gambling. followed by lottery and fruit machine betting. And among non-problem gamblers, we see lottery play, bingo, and sports betting were the most common forms of gambling. When we look at the risk of gambling problems by whether or not somebody engages in online versus in-person gambling, again, this is very in line with what we see all over the world. Among only 7.9% of non-problem gamblers reported gambling online in the past year, and this is in contrast to almost 2/3 or 61% of high-risk gamblers reported gambling online in the past year. So that was a sampling of the of some of the information from the report. There are a lot more tables, extensive analysis of this data that will be available to you all in the report. So to summarize, what we have is so just over half of the Cyprus population, or 55.3, reported gambling last year. The most popular form of gambling among the general population is lottery, not surprising, followed by sports betting and then bingo. 1.5% of people living in Cyprus met the criteria for problem gambling. This is certainly at the higher range of recent studies, but historically, when we look internationally, is not outside of that which has been observed internationally. Among the 2.6% of people living in Cyprus who would be considered high-risk gamblers, there's certainly a profile there. We know that they tend to be between 18 to 34 years old, male. There's some other information in the report. They tend to be more likely to report gambling to distract themselves or escape. They are more likely to smoke tobacco and binge drink alcohol and be less happy and report serious mental health issues. They're also more likely to engage in online gambling and sports betting. I think the findings in here, in May 2022, the authority released a safer gambling strategy. In this strategy, there's a lot of information there about how the strategy the authority will use a public health lens to address gambling-related harm in Cyprus by protecting society from harms related to gambling, preventing gambling-related harm, and supporting people affected by gambling-related harm. The information in this report will be really helpful in trying to navigate this strategy. And we certainly here at Greo encourage looking at this data and using some of this information to help move that public health strategy forward. Finally, I think it's important to note that though there has been prevalence studies done in the Republic of Cyprus, this one uses different methodology and different questions. So at this point, it's very difficult to determine whether or not there is changes or trends. So we can't derive trends from this study. It will be important to replicate this study in the future using the same method, the same questionnaire design, to be able to see whether there are changes in gambling participation and problem gambling in the Cyprus population. But at this point, it's very difficult to compare, and we would argue that it wouldn't be correct to compare this study with the results of previous studies in problem gambling in Cyprus. And so I'll end with that. I'd like to acknowledge the team at Greo Evidence Insights and our collaboration with Insights Market Research. And thank you all for listening. I hope I was clear and you could hear me clearly, and my voice was, and I spoke slowly enough. Thank you very much.